My name is Heidi, and I will be presenting our paper Staying and Engaging in Work Against the Odds, investigating corporate Stockholm Syndrome on the behalf of our team, myself, Alexei Koveshnikov, and Cécile Dujoux. The growing interest in toxic workplace has attracted a relatively large number of publications in recent years. Research has focused in particular on destructive, abusive, or authoritarian leaderships, deviant and unethical leaders' behaviors, narcissist and nightmare traits of leaders, or controlling and over-centralized workplaces. Very briefly explained, the literature mainly focused on where toxic workplaces could arise and with what negative consequences for the organization, how hostile cultures are fed and sustained, and how employees cope within such environments. Yet, insufficient attention has been paid to the more particular case of employees who stay and engage in their work at hostile and toxic workplaces. Anecdotal research provides indirect evidence that employees working in such environments may stay in such organizations when all predictions would see them leave, as the perception of abusing supervision has been shown to be universally negative with multiple outcome variables. The lack of attention to this phenomenon contrasts with recent practitioner discourse around what has been labeled as Corporate Stockholm Syndrome, characterizing the phenomenon when employees identify themselves with and/or remain loyal to the supervisor who mistreat them and are manifestly hostile to their own interest. Although these may directly touch only a relatively small share of employees, workplaces of various degrees of toxicity are more widespread than we often realize and contribute to the general dehumanization of the organization and the workplace. In this study, we intend to fill this gap by explaining three different mechanisms behind this phenomenon that are normalization and compliance, decreased sense of confidence and self-undermining, and identification and commitment. The first mechanism relates to the possibility that under certain conditions employees start to perceive the toxic workplaces as normal and non-extraordinary. Research showed that, for instance, women might remain in abusive relationship with their partners and husbands because they are confined to a specific gender role, which dictates that being a wife and a mother are the most important roles for women. At the organizational level, similar psychological mechanisms might be at play. We argue that two factors might lead to employees normalizing and accepting the toxicity of their workplaces are the tenure in the organization and power distance organization, the extent to which an individual accepts the unequal distribution of power in institutions and organizations. Another possible and possibly complementary explanation would be that such workplaces tend to affect negatively employees' self-confidence and produce self-undermining perceptions among employees. Research has discussed the concept of learned helplessness that captures a perception that there is a little relationship between behaviors and outcome, which is likely to sustain also in the future. Typically, learned helplessness results, among other things, in motivational and cognitive deficits that prevent individuals from taking action to remove them from the position of helplessness. In such situation, employees come to believe that their behaviors will have no impact on the situation and will not correct the toxicity of the workplace because the toxicity is deeply embedded in the practices of the organization. Hence, they become less inclined to act and resist the toxic organization. We argue that two factors might explain this: proactive career self-management behaviors and perceived overqualifications. The third explanation would be the possibility that employees start to identify closely with the organization and/or the abusive leader so that these identifications become an important part of employee self-identity. As a result, employees develop a sense of psychological commitment to the leaders and organizations. In practice, data were collected from an online survey gathering responses from 487 employees working in a toxic environment. A workplace was interpreted as toxic if one of the following conditions was verified. The employees perceived their workplace as over-centralized and over-controlling, the leaders as abusive or authoritarian. The employees experienced burnout and worked overly long hours, which would be above 60 hours per week. As why some employees engage in their work and intend to stay while working in a toxic and hostile workplace do not fit well the theoretical explanations, we assume that different combinations of variables are possible in explaining these outcomes. That's why we use a qualitative comparative analysis to investigate various combinations of causal conditions that lead to the outcomes of interest, in our case work engagement and intention to stay in the organization, rather than a single solution. The measures of the conditions used in the study are described below. They are the 6 factors we just mentioned before. All scales come from established literature. The first set of findings relates to the intention to stay while working in a toxic environment. We found 4 solutions, or let's say configurations. 1. Normalized toxicity with longer tenure, higher acceptance of power distance. And then Corporate Stockholm Syndromes of type 1 and type 2, both showing high identification to the leader and the organization. And 4th, the learned helplessness, with, for instance, low career self-management. The second set of findings relates to engaging while working in a toxic environment. 5 solutions were found: self-blaming behavior, novice behavior, compliant behavior, and other types of corporate Stockholm syndromes type 3 and 4, where we find once again a possible strong identification with both the organization and the leader. Altogether, these solutions demonstrate, beside the complexity of the phenomenon, the existence of corporate Stockholm syndrome in toxic and hostile organizations. This topic, to the best of our knowledge, has thus far been left with little attention in management research. On the practical side, it is really about having better leaders or better workplaces. Several researchers have called for rehabilitation and acknowledgement of emotion, irrationality, and/or power games in the workplace. Yet, restoring the humanity side of the workplace is a two-sided coin. On the one hand, it means acknowledging that individuals come into organization with their personality traits, weaknesses, deviances, irrationalities, and dark sides. That often leads to mistakes, conflicts, or abuses. It seems unrealistic to free the workplace from narcissists, tyrant-like, power-seeking and/or abusive and authoritarian leaders completely. What we could do, though, on the other hand, is to protect, but also empower, the most vulnerable employees. Thank you for your time.